Recently, I've been thinking quite introspectively, debating contrasting opinions, and largely combating the pitchforked crowds of humbug mega fans on my previous Arctic Monkeys video. But, whilst in a deep meditative state, last night By the Strokes came on through my speaker, and I couldn't help but instantly jump up and start to down vodka, all while smashing up my living room. And in the waking madness, I had a great idea. Why don't I invite more angry comments to my videos and rank every album by The Strokes, from worst to best? Now, The Strokes are a band that are held to a standard hitherto unknown by many an average person. Yet to indie fanboys across the land, the unified dads of the Arctic Monkeys are often heralded to godlike status. I mean, if Alex Turner kicks off one of his albums with I Just Wanted to Be One of the Strokes, it's probably safe to assume they're a pretty decent band, outside of arguing who heard The Strokes first in order to assume total domination over an indie-fueled conversation. It's also interesting to hear people's takes on which order they rank the albums in. Personally, for me, a lot of the albums blended into one after a while, and I don't mean that in a bad or negative way. I just found it hard to differentiate between them. So, before making this video, I was sure to give all their albums a re-listen, and to be honest, I'm still none the wiser. But after giving myself a serious talking to, finally devised a godlike list, ranking each Strokes album from worst to best. Before we get into the rankings though, I need to give an honourable mention to the EP, Future, Present, Past, as it contains my favourite Strokes song, Threat of Joy, which to be honest, encompasses the best of Strokes' chiller vibe within a single song. Now, the warning as usual, this video may cause saltiness. So, now that all of that's out of the way, get your pitchforks at the ready and let's get on with it. So, reaching the bottom of the list for me is First Impressions of Earth. The way this album develops throughout is kind of what lets it down for me, and makes me consider if the album got its name from a bunch of aliens visiting Earth and all the while pretending to be the Strokes and recording an album. For me, the album starts off incredibly strong. You Only Live Once is one of my favourite Strokes songs, and Juicebox has a bass line that makes me feel as if I'm playing Crash Bandicoot, but at times it starts to feel like as if the Strokes are imitating Fall Out Boy a bit, which for an American band in the 2000s wasn't particularly hard. For me, the album has a major drop off in the middle in terms of listening enjoyment, which I think is a shame, because if there was more of a consistent listening experience throughout, this actually might be one of their best. But sadly there isn't one, so here it is at the bottom of the list. Next on the list for me is Angles. Now, when you kick off an album with a reggae-inspired garage rock sound, it takes me to a very happy place. And it feels like a refreshed sound for the Strokes, probably reflective of their 5-year break after First Impressions of Earth. Even though the song sounds entirely different, the combination of reggae and a style of rock reminds me of Bank Robber by The Clash, a song I particularly love. It starts off the album in a favourable manner for me, and it's instantly followed up by one of the Strokes' more prominent songs, Under Cover of Darkness. It feels like a great follow-up to an opener to keep the good, refreshed vibes going. The album then unfortunately goes in a big strange way and all over the place. There are a few more highlights on the album in Taken for a Fool, or Gratisfaction, and the bass line from Crash Bandicoot returning in Metabolism, which sounds like a Muse song. But overall, Angles reflects a bit more of an experimental return after their brief hiatus, which has some good hitters and some bad misses. Well, here's where I'm aware the ranking might annoy some people, as next on my list is Room on Fire. There's a certain train of thought that sees people say Room on Fire is actually better than their debut, Is This It? But to me, I've never seen Room on Fire as anywhere near the level of their debut. And to me, the album sounds like a baseline of ideas for Strokes songs that never took off. Now, I do think it's an alright album, and it's quite easy listening to me. It just doesn't come across as particularly inspired, and it doesn't live up to its predecessor. I think also for myself, I'm not saying it's a bad song, but I genuinely cannot stand the song Reptilia. And before everyone gets angry at me, I understand why it's a great song. I understand why everyone else loves it. I just don't like it, and that's just me. But it doesn't go in the album's favour. As to be honest, I do see it as the only thing on the album that offers a bit more hype and a bit more change throughout it compared to the rest of the album. I mean, its main strength is that it has great consistency throughout the entire album. It is full of classic Strokes songs, but to be honest, while it does sound like Is This It, it sounds like Is This It without any of the original emotional depth that gave their debut that extra punch and made it stand out from a lot of other music upon its release and even now. If Room on Fire was the Strokes' debut album and Is This It was their second album, the progression of albums would make much more sense. But for me, Room on Fire really took a step back, and I don't see why it's sometimes held to the same standard as Is This It. I mean, I do still enjoy the album though. Now that everyone is probably typing horrifically angry comments, let's continue with the list. Sitting just above Room on Fire, for me, is Come Down Machine. To me, this album is classic Strokes, reflecting great intro songs and bringing across upbeat energy, alongside a few stylistic changes at times, but to me they come across quite well, such as the repeated appearance of falsetto singing in the album, and I find it to be one of their easier listening and more enjoyable albums throughout, to be honest. But it's confusing as I often see this album get a fair bit of hate. To put it into perspective, people love their second album because it's what you call classic Strokes. People then hate their third and fourth albums because it's experimental with dashes of classic Strokes. Then people also hate Come Down Machine because it's classic Strokes. I'm a bit genuinely bewildered. To me, Come Down Machine offers more in terms of classic Strokes vibe, whilst hinting at some slight changes in sound. And that means it shows development from their previous albums. I mean, I suppose you could argue it's a bit unambitious, but that's exactly how the second album feels to me. At least this album has minor tweaks to songs that make it stand out a bit more. I guess that's just my opinion though. Feel free to tell me why I'm wrong in the comments. But honestly, this is one of my favourite albums of theirs, hence why it sits slightly higher up the list. And second on the list is The New Abnormal. Very much similar to my opinions on Come Down Machine, The New Abnormal stands quite easily at second on the list for me, as it combines a refreshing take on the Strokes sound, all while still maintaining those classic elements that we love from the Strokes. And to be honest, The New Abnormal does this far better than any other release they've had in my opinion, besides their first album. I don't have to skip any songs on this album, and the listening experience is pretty consistent and enjoyable, and rather excellent. I think it's great to see a band that can release an album near 20 years after their initial release, and whilst maybe it's not as good as their debut, it sounds better than anything else they've released. Throughout the album, you still get the classic Strokes stuff, but there's flashes of inspiration from separate sounds coming through. For example, on Eternal Summer, there's a sound that really reminds me of Pink Floyd's The Wall, through a marching beat and commanding vocals. Overall, I really enjoy The New Abnormal every time I listen to it, and I think it was the update that the Strokes have always been looking for since their first album. And they've managed to really nail a consistent sound throughout the record without sounding dated, and that's why it's standing at second place on the list. And then finally, coming in top of the list is This It? I mean, do I need to provide much of a reason for this being at number one? This album came out at the start of the millennia, and it caused a directional shift through influencing bands to start the garage rock scene, and it's directly quoted to be a huge influence on so many bands that I personally love as well. Previously noted Arctic Monkeys, for example. For me, I think this album could be released today and would still sound fresh and new in the current landscape of things. And it has consistent banging tunes throughout that feel fast-paced yet filled with emotion and melancholy. This album has truly become a classic in its own right. I can always return to this album without skipping a single song. I think the only thing that has maybe anything on this album outside of it is Threat of Joy, as I previously said. But besides that, the remainder of my favourite Strokes songs pretty much lie on this album. It's a true work of art that kicked off a new wave of music, and it deserves every bit of love it gets. Some people might think it's sad that they haven't managed to top their original album, but to be honest, I think when you produce something that is of such a high standard and change the direction of music for future bands, you can never look at that in a negative way. It's an impressive achievement that most musicians don't get, and it should be looked upon favourably. For me, it stands out as the Strokes' best work by far. So, there it is, my ranking of the Strokes albums from best to worst. Let me know what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? I can't wait to hear the lovely comments on my opinions of Room on Fire and Come Down Machine. And on that note, I think I'll say ta-ra for now, and I'll see you later.